Well, hey there and welcome back to my channel. And if this is your first time here, welcome. So glad that you could join us. In this video, we're gonna look at one of the major social movements during our time period, namely the Abolitionist Movement. And if you've been watching my videos for a while, you probably already know that anytime we're dealing with major themes or major movements in world history, there's gonna be a review packet available, jam-packed full of information on all the key terms, people and concepts that you need to know. And you can get that at my website. Okay, so let's get to it. What in the world was the Abolitionist Movement? Well, as the name implies, it was a massive campaign to put an end to slavery and the slave trade around the entire globe. Now, it really picked up steam in the late 18th century and continued all the way into the 19th century. But it was not at all confined to just those 2 centuries. Slavery has existed in many forms in many societies throughout history, but these folks were really the first to try to outlaw slavery everywhere. Now, it wasn't that people hadn't questioned slavery before, but these folks were the first to seriously challenge it on a large scale, thanks largely to the ideas of the Enlightenment. Many abolitionists, especially in Britain, were part of what we call the religious right, groups like the Quakers who thought slavery was a real affront to their Christian values. You see, Christianity teaches that all men are created equal in the eyes of God. And so to hold another human being in bondage seemed contrary to the teachings of Jesus. So the Enlightenment and religion kind of go hand in hand here. They believed that slavery violated natural rights. In fact, they argued that slavery was an institution that was incompatible with any notion of individual liberty and equality. So how did they go about abolishing something that was deeply rooted in economic systems all over the world? Well, initially, abolitionists went to court. In 1772, a guy named Somerset was taken to court in England because he had been brought to England as a slave. And in 1772, the English courts ruled that since slavery had no basis in English law, Somerset needed to be set free. And that was a big deal because England was, of course, a major player in the transatlantic slave trade. This was also around the time when revolutionary fervor was growing across the Atlantic. And American patriots were calling for more rights and representation in Parliament. And so it was easy enough for them to extend those arguments to enslaved people as well. They argued that if the king couldn't impose taxes on his American subjects without their consent, then he certainly didn't have the right to keep people in bondage. By the late 18th century, abolitionists were powerful enough in both Britain and America to push for the outlawing of the African slave trade. Now, remember that the vast majority of enslaved people in the Americas were descended from Africans who had been kidnapped and transported across the Atlantic under horrible conditions. And so many abolitionists wanted to start by outlawing the slave trade, at least, because it would directly stop the flow of human beings into slavery. And so finally, in 1807, after decades of debate, the British Empire outlawed the African slave trade. And the United States followed suit the same year. And so by 1807, the Atlantic slave trade came to an official end. But abolitionists weren't satisfied with just stopping the flow of new enslaved people. They wanted to end slavery altogether. And so now their goal became the complete emancipation of every single person who was enslaved. And they made some progress. Between 1807 and 1838, slavery was completely abolished in the British West Indies. And then in the 1840s, it was abolished in most of the remaining French colonies as well. Let's focus on the United States in particular. And let me introduce you to some of the key players in the abolitionist movement there. So there were 2 main factions in the abolitionist movement. On the one hand, you had people like Thomas Clarkson and William Wilberforce in Britain and William Lloyd Garrison, Lucretia Mott and Frederick Douglass in the United States. Now, these folks were very similar in that they were usually white, middle-class Americans who had come to abhor slavery and the slave trade. And then on the other hand, you had the likes of Frederick Douglass, who was, of course, formerly enslaved. And he and others like him spoke out against slavery in powerful ways. For instance, in 1845, Frederick Douglass published his autobiography, which recounted his life as a slave and his eventual escape to freedom. And it was incredibly powerful. It made abolitionism far more personal and thus persuasive to the American public. And he traveled extensively, speaking to audiences about his experiences and demanding an end to slavery. Now, the most important thing to understand about the abolitionist movement is that it was a moral crusade. These people saw slavery as a great evil that needed to be done away with yesterday. And so that makes it a little difficult to categorize them as simply a social movement or a political movement or anything like that. But the moral dimension was the most important thing to them. They saw slavery as an assault on human dignity, and they demanded its end on those grounds. Now, there were divisions within abolitionism. Some abolitionists, particularly in the United States, were what we might call constitutional abolitionists. They believed that slavery was a great evil that needed to be done away with immediately and completely. There was no place for compromise here. Now, other abolitionists, however, were more moderate, and they argued for a gradual decline of slavery. They still thought it was wrong, but they didn't think it should be ended immediately. But the vast majority of abolitionists fell into the former category. They wanted slavery gone yesterday. Let me tell you about one of the most famous abolitionists in U.S. history, a man named John Brown. He was a violent abolitionist who undertook a series of attacks against slaveholders in the years leading up to the Civil War. His goal was to incite a slave rebellion that would bring an end to slavery once and for all. In 1859, he and his son seized a federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, intending to distribute the weapons to enslaved people who would then rise up against their masters. But he was captured and executed for treason and conspiracy. Now, Brown was a fringe element in the abolitionist movement. Most abolitionists rejected his violent tactics, but his willingness to sacrifice himself for the cause made him a martyr and thus a powerful symbol for the abolitionist movement. So to wrap all this up, let's talk about the legacy of the abolitionist movement. First of all, it played a critical role in shaping national policies, not only in the United States but throughout Europe and internationally as well. The movement succeeded in outlawing slavery in the majority of the Western world, although, of course, it would continue to persist in other parts of the world, most notably in Brazil and in the Ottoman Empire. Secondly, abolitionism helped to shift the course of world history. The fight to end slavery was inextricably linked to the fight for individual rights and equality. And abolitionism forced Western nations to confront the compatibility of slavery with Enlightenment ideals. In fact, abolitionism was such a powerful force that it helped to lay the groundwork for modern international human rights discourse. And finally, abolitionism in the United States was intimately tied to other reform movements, including the women's rights movement and the temperance movement. In other words, it was part of a larger culture of reform that swept the United States in the decades before the Civil War. Alright, click right over here to grab a review packet if you need help getting in your class and a 5 on your exam in May. And then I'm gonna put my Latin teacher face on right now and say, happy studying and good luck on your exam. Okay, I'm done now. Bye.